Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Tales of the Hunger Games. I hope you've all had a great week and that everyone is well. Before we begin, I'd once again like to thank my Patreons, and I'd also like to thank Andrew McLean for all the art that is provided in this episode and since the reclamation. If you'd like to check his link, it will be in the description along with lots of other links that are related to this series. So without further ado, let's start the 83rd games that took place in the year 95. After a relatively uneventful reaping took place in District 12, Lynette Laurier made her way under the careful guard of the capital to District 11. This reaping was marked by an intense rainstorm that had settled over this area of Panem, which caused the reaping to feel somewhat rushed this year. In order to keep the process unaffected, the stage was covered in a large tarpaulin, which helped keep Lynette and the reaping bowls dry. After a very quick speech that was practically inaudible to the crowds of green-clad youths who were beginning to shiver beneath the cold rain, Lynette picked a name from the bowl of the girls' names. 13-year-old Pandoria Duverne was announced to be this year's female tribute for District 11, and through the rain that appeared to be growing stronger, the peacekeepers quickly seized a relatively tall girl with a large dark afro that was weighed down by the rainfall and was now bedraggled upon her ebony skin. Pandoria was the only child of a relatively well-to-do family that was responsible for the allocation of labour within the district. As she was escorted to the stage, her lime green dress clearly became stuck against her back from the rain. Without saying a word, Pandoria shook hands with Lynette, who immediately wiped her now wet hand against her own dress before heading over to the male reaping bowl. Without noticing the mounting annoyance of the observing crowds, Lynette spent a prolonged time rumbling her hand around the reaping bowl until she picked up a name from its depths. She called 18-year-old Easter Rollix as this year's male tribute. As the camera showed Easter, he let out an exasperated sigh before slowly walking to the platform whilst brushing his short black hair away from his forehead. Easter was known to be a reliable worker of the LeBlanc alcohol production facility in the wetlands, who had dropped out of school as soon as he could, in order to support his family after his father's death, with his name being placed 44 times in the reaping bowl this year. When Easter arrived on the stage, he removed his dark green jacket that appeared to cling onto his ivory skin as he removed it. He then shook hands with both Lynette and Pandoria, and Lynette quickly dismissed the citizens, which caused a small stampede from the square as Lynette, Pandoria, and Easter were each escorted into the town hall. Easter's younger brothers and mother all came to visit him. Whilst he assured his brothers that he would do his best to come back, he asked his mother to stay behind, and when he was certain that his brothers were out of earshot, he told his mother the location of some monies that he had hidden in the likely event that he did not make it back. Shortly after confirming this location, Easter's mother was removed from the room amidst her cries of anguish, and Easter was taken down to the station. Meanwhile, Pandoria's parents had come to visit her. They gave her the best advice that they could. Although being table workers, they were not as experienced with the physical skills that their fellow citizens would be. It was reported by an AVOX who was awaiting in the carriage that even when the train journey started, Easter and Pandoria did not attempt to start a conversation with each other. After a few minutes, Easter's mentor, Geranio Landry, entered the carriage and introduced himself to the pair. However, before Easter could even speak, Pandoria immediately asked where her mentor, Bluebell Jansen, was at this time, to which Geranio responded that firstly, Bluebell did not like to go anywhere near to District 11, let alone to the train station, and furthermore, her health had recently declined, which meant that she was resting in her own house. Pandoria seemed annoyed by this, but Geranio said that he would help them both during this journey, and he spoke to them about what to expect over the upcoming week. Although Easter paid heed, Pandoria did not seem particularly interested in what Geranio was saying. He then asked Pandoria why she was being so quiet, to which she replied that neither of them had any chance of winning, so what was the point of listening? Yet after hearing this, Geranio grinned and responded that he and his district partner, Lavender, had said the same thing about themselves, before each going on to do rather well in the games. He also reminded Pandoria that last year's victor, Lynette Laurier, was the youngest so far, which had given hope to many younger tributes around Panem. After realizing that the girl Geranio was referring to had started the company for which Easter now worked, he asked more about what Lavender was like, before and after the games, to which Geranio responded that she had saved his life. During this time, Pandoria helped herself to the provided food, without paying much attention to Geranio and Easter's conversation, even though Geranio was giving advice on which weapon they should try to practice with during the training. At the first sign of sunset, Pandoria stated that she was tired, and she withdrew to her carriage, although instead of trying to sleep, she tried on some of the clothing that had been provided in her carriage. Easter and Geranio continued to walk together, and according to the Avox present, they looked like a pair of friends who had known each other for a while. When the sun fully set, they each retired to their own carriages. Whilst Easter and Pandoria's journey was taking place, Lynette arrived in District 9, and luckily for her, the rainstorms that had so far been flowing after her seemed to cease, and she was blessed with the sunlight that was more common in this central district. After a brief tour of the district's central settlement, the reaping began, although Lynette seemed rather enamoured by the beige colours that the youths wore, and in order to complete the reaping as soon as possible, the district's mayor quickly offered her an array of beige clothing once the reaping was complete. The female tribute was named as 16-year-old Millet MacDonald. Although she was known for her infectious smile, Millet at first seemed devastated by the news of her reaping, but as she made her way between the two enclosures, she seemed to return to form. Her neatly cut dress that was embellished in wheat stalks showed just the right level of skin and district pride. This by itself stood out to Capital viewers, with several asking if this dress had been professionally made, which led to high levels of surprise when they realised that Millet had made it herself for the reaping. Shortly after Millet shook hands with Lynette and Lynette had finished admiring her dress, the reaping was ushered along by the peacekeepers, and Lynette's next choice was 16-year-old Flax Barker. The sound of his name immediately caused murmurs through the crowd, as a pale and sickly frame of a boy made his way through the reaping enclosures. Halfway through his walk to the stage, he stopped walking, claiming he was in pain, which led to the peacekeepers practically dragging him the rest of the way. Once Flax was on the stage, he coughed profusely, and Lynette looked rather hesitant to shake his hand in the moments that followed, although she and Millet eventually did so. The crowds were then dismissed, and Millet and Flax were escorted into the town hall. Millet was visited by her parents, 2 older brothers, and many friends, who tearfully wished her luck and gave her any piece of advice that they appeared able to think of. Meanwhile, Flax, who only stopped coughing for brief moments, was visited by his mother and younger sister, with his mother begging for Flax to be replaced due to his ill health, but her pleas were automatically ignored, and the tributes were quickly placed on the train for the capital. With no living victors from their district, the pair's mentor was assigned to be Jupiter's Monty, a leading member of the Reclaimers who had worked hard to bring District 9 back from the rebel clutches. Although Jupiter's was a rather short man, who often opted to wear long, flowing cloaks, he possessed a powerhouse of muscular strength beneath these layers, which made him a particularly strong fighter, especially when empty-handed. According to the Avox who was present on this train, Millet was trying to find some water from the table of food in order to give to Flax, who was in the middle of yet another coughing fit. But shortly after Millet found a jug of water, she turned around to see Jupiter's, who was standing directly behind her. This made Millet jump with terror, and she dropped the jug to the floor, which smashed at their feet. Jupiter's then looked at Flax, who was struggling to breathe through his persistent coughing, then back at Millet, who seemed to be checking the floor for glass, before rolling his eyes and stating that the pair were not off to the best of starts. After getting some water for Flax and sitting down with him and Millet, Jupiter's engaged in some light discussion with Millet about her life in District 9. However, a few minutes into the conversation, Jupiter suddenly stood up and ordered the pair to attack him. Both Millet and Flax looked at each other with confusion, but when Jupiter shouted at them once again, Flax quickly got up and charged towards him. When Flax was within reach, Jupiter grabbed him by the collar and threw him sideways towards the corner of the carriage. Millet appeared shocked by what she had just seen, but as Jupiter marched towards Flax, who was having another coughing fit in the corner of the carriage, she grabbed a glass fruit bowl from the dining table. Instead of attacking Flax further, Jupiter turned towards Millet and grinned, before charging towards her. However, she quickly threw the fruit bowl as hard as she could towards Jupiter's. He quickly dodged and the bowl smashed against the wall by Flax, who had just got up, although this sudden impact near his head made him shout out in terror and fall back down again. Jupiter sniggered as he looked at Flax, who was trying to overcome his latest round of spluttering, before turning back to Millet, and saying that this was the fire that he wanted to see. Whilst even Millet looked shocked at what she had just done, Jupiter clicked his fingers at the Avox who was present to clear up the damage from the fight, and he ordered Flax to go to his carriage. After Flax had left, Jupiter spoke to Millet about the upcoming week and how she could make the best impression possible. It is also alleged that Jupiter even spoke to Millet in a rather mean manner, whilst insisting that she held her composure and remained strong, possibly in a way to harden her personality for the upcoming week. As the night set in, Jupiter poured himself and Millet a glass of scotch and asked her about what she would do if she won the games. Although Millet managed to entertain Jupiter with her remaining conversation, he insisted after a few glasses that she head to her room so that she could rest before the next day. Once the tributes had settled into their accommodation quarters, they were taken in pairs to be dressed for the parade the next day. For their fitting, Easter and Pandoria were taken to the Jansen mansions, where they were led into Bluebell's boudoir. Bluebell had once again arranged for her grandson, Claudius Creed, to be the stylist for these tributes, and as he took measurements of the pair, Bluebell asked Geranio to feed her grapes and show her the potential parade outfits, before she eventually decided that the pair would be dressed in lemon-laced vines. Although in poor health and restricted to her bed, Bluebell was still able to bark commands at her grandson, Claudius, whilst making suggestive comments towards Easter and stating that she wished he had been in her arena, which prompted Claudius to tell his grandmother to not be inappropriate on several occasions. Meanwhile, Millet and Flax were given Johio Breen as their stylist, and for a whole 5 minutes he made the pair stand completely still, whilst pacing around them in circles, until he finally clicked his fingers and shouted that they would be covered entirely in bread loaves. When this was announced, Jupiter nodded and winked at Millet, whose face was a spectacle of disbelief. They then had very realistic-looking bread crusts strapped to their arms, legs, and torsos. The next evening was the parade. On the first chariot, Relic and Almandine, both from 1, immediately made a brilliant impression in a bedazzling pair of rainbow bodysuits, with rubies around their shoulders, all the way down to purple amethyst stones by their thighs. Bob and Norrie, both from 4, also revealed themselves to be competitors of strong potential, with their stylist choosing to put them in deconstructed fishing nets that showed the true extent of their muscular frames, and was likely what earned them this year's Best Dressed in Anderson fashion. When Millet and Flax's chariot entered the parade, they both initially waved to the crowd, and Jupiter allegedly said that he was relieved that the sickly one wasn't ruining it. But shortly after he said this, Flax began to have a coughing fit that was so intense that he almost fell off the chariot, but luckily for him, Millet managed to catch his hand. She then supported Flax against her side, and continued to wave to the crowd with her one free hand, which caused louder cheers from the audience and a sigh of relief from Jupiter's. As for Easter and Pandoria, they each waved to the crowd, but Geranio appeared to notice that they were not making much of an impression, especially compared to the tributes from District 10 in front of them, who had just tossed their Stetsons to the audience. However, after briefly appearing to whisper in each other's ears, Easter and Pandoria started to rip some of the faux lemons from their vines, and they threw them into the stands. This caused clamours from the audience as they tried to catch these lemons, in order to keep as mementos of this eventful parade. The training began the next morning, with very mixed results and actions from this year's ball of tributes. Flax made practically no attempt to practice with any weapons, and whilst his coughing had temporarily ceased, he claimed to feel fatigued and unable to exercise, which led him to sit at the side of the training area. Although the staff initially made efforts to move Flax, they got bored of his lack of will and subsequently left him, in order to focus on other tributes. Yet Millet used this time to make a strong impression, not only on the training staff, for quickly being able to pick up new skills, but also on her fellow tributes, for her kind and helpful manner. In exchange for showing them how to use a scythe most effectively, Jack and Coyle, both from 3, allowed Millet to watch them in the electronics station, and they even showed her how to power a basic circuit, whilst Louisiana, from 6, showed Millet how to camouflage her own skin, in exchange for a detailed description of a wheat field, for which Louisiana then tried to camouflage her skin. By the end of the first day, Millet had spoken to every other tribute, including the careers, who allowed her to watch them fight. Zella, from 2, even let Millet spar with her, and although Zella was a much stronger opponent, she gave Millet some advice on how to defend herself, before Castor, from 2, called Zella back to him. During the deliberations at the end of this day, Jupiter's completely ignored Flax, who was taking a nap, but he congratulated Millet on her strong diplomacy, but he reminded her to not become too attached. On the second day, Millet worked with Pandoria and Easter in the spear station. Easter had spent the vast majority of the first day there, whilst Pandoria had practiced in the survival station. Although Easter practically ignored Millet and instead chose to improve his skill with the spears, Pandoria spoke to Millet and asked her how she had made her reaping dress. The girls quickly seemed to build a rapport, and at Pandoria's request, Easter showed them both how to throw a spear as accurately yet forcefully as possible. This training did indeed improve the girls' proficiency with the spears, and Easter appeared to finally gain some respect for Pandoria's skills. Yet whilst Millet nipped off to the toilet during the afternoon break, Easter reminded Pandoria that Millet was not her friend, and that she would be likely to kill her as soon as she had the chance. Once they had finished their training for the second day, Geranio spoke to Easter and Pandoria in their accommodation quarters, whilst Bluebell spoke to them through a screen that showed her from her bed. Geranio confirmed that whilst it may be advantageous to have Millet as an ally, they would need to keep an eye on her. Bluebell also stated that while she respected anyone who could get around, they should be careful of someone who seemed to be making allies with everyone else. The next day, the assessment took place. It is unknown what Flax did or if he even did anything, but he scored a 2, whilst Millet showed an array of new skills and scored a respectable 7. As for Easter, he threw a collection of spears with a relatively strong level of accuracy and scored a 9, whilst Pandoria attempted to camouflage herself, and Training Master Crane stated that she looked like a desperate swamp monster, which only scored her a 5. The final night before the games, the interviews took place. Although Eugenia Ravenstill was in her second trimester with her son, Enya School, she was dressed as a rather glamorous mannequin dummy, as a nod to the previous year's games. The interviews went smoothly, although Simeon, from 7, was thought to be rather arrogant, especially towards the end of his interview, which garnered several waves of jeers from the crowd, whilst Lint, from 8, began to cry when she spoke about her family that she had left behind, which clearly left Eugenia in a rather awkward position. Flax's interview was a complete disaster. He did not speak to Eugenia and only nodded and shook his head to the questions she asked, and the atmosphere became even more uncomfortable when Flax coughed blood onto Eugenia's dress as he left the stage. Although ever the professional, Eugenia joked that it looked like she was in the games this year, and simply carried on with the proceedings. Millet proceeded to make a much better impression. She spoke to Eugenia in a way that seemed like they were old friends who had been meaning to meet up for a while. Eugenia also tried to extract some gossip from Millet about the other tributes, although Millet only had positives to say about each of them. However, when Eugenia asked if she fancied any of them, Millet stated that if she stayed alive long enough within the games, then the audience might find out, which gathered laughter and cheers from the audience. When it was Easter's turn, he remained stoic, and whilst his answers were much shorter than those of other tributes, he was still friendly, and even wished Eugenia well with her pregnancy, which triggered sympathetic sounds from the audience. As for Pandoria, her interview did not go brilliantly, but it was not awful either. Overall, she was quite forgettable. Following the rather boring interview with Healer from 12, game maker Mortimer Whimsywick entered the stage to a standing ovation from the crowd. Upon seeing Eugenia's mannequin-themed outfit, he told her to get back into the factory, which caused laughter. When asked about the upcoming arena, Whimsywick stated that he was planning to use something more traditional this year, and that the ending hazard was going to be great fun to watch, which produced extremely interested sounds from the audience and terrified expressions from the tributes. At noon the next day, the tributes were led to their holding rooms beneath the arena, where they were dressed in black trousers, white t-shirts and trainers, along with jackets of their district colours. Jupiter's only visited Millet, and he told her that of all his 16 mentees so far, she was the one who seemed most capable of winning, and that she should just carry on being her friendly self. Millet thanked Jupiter's, and to his surprise she embraced him. Although Jupiter's facial expression read that this had never happened to him before, he reciprocated Millet's embrace, and he put her beige jacket over her arms and wished her luck, before winking at her and leaving. Easter and Pandoria were both visited by Geranio, who brought a portable screen, which showed Bluebell's face. Bluebell said to Easter that even if he died, he would look good doing so, which made Geranio threaten to turn off the screen, but Bluebell was then serious, and told Easter to grab a spear and then run for his life. Geranio shook his hand and wished him the best before leaving. As for Pandoria, Geranio told her to try and ally with either Easter, Millet, or both of them, although Bluebell also warned her to be ready to kill Millet at a moment's notice. The tributes then entered their tubes and rose into the arena. This year's games took place in a sweltering marshland. Unlike past arenas, this year's arena was completely flat. The point where the perimeter touched the ground was visible from the cornucopia, even though they stood 3 kilometers from each other. Wispy white clouds floated through the azure sky, above mazes of cold water that trailed through the marshy grassland and were deep enough to reach the height of an averagely sized tribute's neck. After moving approximately halfway through the arena from the cornucopia, one would come across small forests that were designed to provide a form of shelter or even a safe haven for tributes. In the waterways of the outer circles of the arena were irritable hippos that were likely to snap at, bite, and even attempt to eat tributes, the latter of which had unfortunately occurred to several test subjects during the experimental phases of this arena. Back in the centre of the arena was the area known as the Cornucopia Lake. Despite the fact that, like last year's arena, there was no official cornucopia structure, instead 24 grass mounds were dotted around the outer area of this warm, muddy lake. 12 smaller grass mounds were placed further into the centre of the lake, and upon each of them was an array of bread loaves and blocks of cheese. As for the centre of the lake, a much larger mound was placed in the very centre and contained a large pile of various weapons, along with several water filters. When Pandoria from 11 rose into the arena, she immediately squinted at the sun that shone directly onto the central lake from above. Like several other tributes, she immediately seemed to feel the effects of this heat, and she looked at Tremor from 5, who was on the mound to her left, trying to take off his jacket without it falling in the water. Pandoria then looked round and saw Easter from 11, directly opposite her, between Castor from 2 and Sorba from 7. He made eye contact with Pandoria, but shook his head as he looked at her, seemingly in an effort to dissuade her from heading inwards to the central mound. She then looked to her right, and a few podiums along she saw Millet from 9, who was busy looking around at the other tributes and appearing to try and make eye contact with several of them. However, Millet was quickly distracted by Flax from 9, who stood opposite her. He began coughing extremely loudly on his mound, and the sound became so loud that the countdown, which had just gone through 20 seconds, was drowned out by this cacophony. Almandine from 1, who stood on a podium adjacent to Flax, tried to ignore him, while Simeon from 7, who was stood on the other side of Flax, shouted at him to be quiet, which alerted the attention of several tributes and even triggered a suspenseful sound of interest in Snow Square. When the countdown had passed through 10 seconds, most tributes seemed to be ignoring Flax's coughing fit, which was growing even louder. But just at that moment, Flax coughed some blood and he found himself bending forwards in pain. Yet due to there being nothing for him to lean against, he lost his balance and tumbled straight forwards into the water. Almandine, Simeon, and several other tributes automatically recoiled as Flax's body hit the water. Seeing as in a past game, a girl from District 7 had dropped her token and caused the surrounding mines to explode. Yet this time, all that was heard was what Eugenia described as a brief fizz in the water that was followed by a cannon, and Flax's body came up to the surface. Most tributes then noticed that the countdown had just gone through 3 seconds, and the gong proceeded to sound. Pandoria was one of 5 tributes who immediately jumped backwards and quickly waded through the shallower water towards the edge of the lake, before climbing up onto the marshland and running. She occasionally looked back to see most of the other tributes swimming through the lake to the central mound, but she continued running onwards. Millet, on the other hand, dived straight into the water and swam straight towards the nearest mound to contain food supplies. She saw that Healer from 12, who had been on the mound next to her, was also wading through the water towards her, but she grabbed all the food from the mound before shoving it into her jacket's pockets. Millet then looked onto the centre, where Bob and Norrie, both from 4, had been the first to reach the larger mound, which they were now defending from other tributes. Millet seemed tempted to at least approach this area, but as more tributes were beginning to near this mound, and Healer was angrily wading towards her, Millet quickly waded away from Healer towards another edge of the lake. Meanwhile, Easter had dived straight into the lake at the sound of the gong, and he swam as quickly as he could towards the central mound. However, he struggled to swim as quickly as the other tributes, and by the time he was only halfway there, Bob and Norrie had grabbed tridents from the central pile, which they were using to swipe at the careers who were trying to climb onto the mound. The careers then scrambled simultaneously onto this central mound and ran for the weapons. Norrie panicked and dived from the mound whilst holding a trident. Bob swiped at Castor and only managed to give him a small cut on his arm, but Easter used this distraction to wade through the water and grab a water filter, which had been kicked from the mound by accident and was now floating in the water. As Bob dived off the mound and away from the range of Castor and Relic from one, who now both had swords, Easter noticed a spear that was in reach on top of the central mound. With only his eyes above the water's surface, he watched as Castor and Relic jumped into the water to his left after the tributes from District 10, without appearing to notice him. Easter also saw that Almandine and Zella, from 2, each had a bow and arrow, but they were now shooting at Louisiana, from 6, and the boy from her district, who were on the other side of the lake. Easter appeared tempted by the spear, and positioned himself just beneath the grass that fringed the mound, so that the girls could not see him. However, Zella quickly ran out of arrows, and as Easter heard Almandine giving her a few more of her own, he quickly thrust himself onto the central mound and grabbed the spear. The girls did notice, but by the time they were ready to shoot at Easter, he was swimming away from the central mound beneath the surface of the water. Once he had made it to the edge of the lake, he got out and ran as quickly as he could through the marshland, and although he was very nearly hit with an arrow by Almandine, he did not seem to even notice. The Careers continued to defend the central mound, and although Zella and Almandine each shot many arrows at as many tributes as they could, the thick jackets that were worn by tributes allowed many of them to avoid serious injury. After having run through the marshes for a few minutes, Pandoria jumped down into one of the waterways, presumably so that she was less visible to other tributes. However, Easter, who was running in the opposite direction to Pandoria, noticed another tribute running just ahead of him, and as he caught up to her, he realized that this was Millet, who saw that it was Easter as he neared her. Once Easter was within a spear's throw of Millet, she stopped running and turned towards Easter and begged for mercy. Easter continued to approach Millet with his spear at the ready, but she suddenly began to cry and dropped to her knees, whilst continuing to beg for her life and the chance to work together with Easter. He appeared to have a change of heart and stopped moving towards Millet, even though his spear was held just inches from her heart. But just at that moment, Millet suddenly looked between Easter's legs, and as she scurried away, she shouted at him to watch out. Easter at first seemed cautious of Millet's warning, and appeared to think that this was a ploy to distract him, but as Millet edged backwards and quick steps could be heard running up behind him, Easter darted around to see Tremor, sprinting towards him with a sword. Just when Easter had fully rotated his body, Tremor swiped his sword at Easter, which cut his right arm, and Tremor continued to try attacking him. Easter then tried jabbing his spear at Tremor, and the pair continually swiped their weapons at each other, but without any bloodshed. Meanwhile, Millet, who had been watching this altercation, noticed Easter's water filter, which he dropped when Tremor first attacked him. Whilst the boys continued fighting, Millet grabbed the filter and ran around to the side of Tremor, who was still focusing on Easter, and did not seem to consider Millet or the filter to be dangerous. Yet as Tremor's eyes locked back onto Easter, Millet threw the filter at Tremor's head, and even though it was not particularly heavy, it made Tremor shout in pain, and this caused enough of a distraction for Easter to jab his spear straight through Tremor's heart. Tremor proceeded to fall to his side into the nearest water, just as Easter turned back to face Millet. As Crane was commentating this scene, he pointed out that Easter had not officially declared an alliance with Millet, but she quickly grabbed their belongings together before saying to Easter that they needed to keep moving, as if they were allies. Apparently realizing from what he had just seen that they were more likely to survive together, Easter did as Millet said, and they began jogging to the perimeter, just as Tremor's cannon sounded. Whilst this pair began to move, the commentators moved their focus to Pandoria, who had just got out of the water, where she had been hiding on the other side of the arena. However, after just over a minute of continuing to run from the centre of the arena, she heard joyous shouts in the distance behind her, and she appeared to notice that these sounds came from Bob and Norrie, who had spotted her and were now chasing after her. Pandoria continued to run across the marshes, occasionally jumping into the water, and then climbing back onto the land, before continuing onwards for the next 5 minutes, whilst Bob and Norrie closed in on her. Once she had reached the outer circles of the arena, Bob and Norrie were within 100 metres of Pandoria, and she ran on in a frenzy, as quickly as she could. Yet after turning back and panicking as the pair began to ready their tridents, Pandoria lost her footing and fell into the water, directly on top of a very large hippo that seemed extremely irritated to have been disturbed whilst it rested in the water. Pandoria shouted in disbelief, apparently having failed to notice these hippos so far, due to how quickly she had been running. But when her shouting morphed into screaming, the hippo roared at her. before lunging forwards and biting at her left arm. Over the next few seconds, Pandoria's arm was badly bitten by the hippo, and she screamed in a mixture of shock and pain at what had just happened. Yet as Pandoria thrashed around in the water and the hippo looked ready to bite her once again, Bob threw his trident directly at her head, which sounded a cannon and made the hippo seem to lose all interest in Pandoria, and so it looked towards Bob and Norrie and began to roar. Bob quickly retrieved his trident from Pandoria's head, and he and Norrie proceeded to run off towards the perimeter. Viewers in Snow Square appeared rather shocked by this scene, even though much more graphic deaths involving animals had occurred in past games. Over the next hour, Easter and Millet reached one of the small forests, roughly halfway between the cornucopia and the perimeter. As Easter rested in exhaustion, Millet kept watch for any other tributes on the horizon, but fortunately for the pair, she could not see any. Easter began to complain about the heat, which Eugenius stated was surprising, seeing as he came from the district that had the highest average temperatures. Millet ripped a branch off a tree and proceeded to fan Easter as he lay on the ground. After opening his eyes and looking pensively at Millet for a few seconds, Easter asked her why she was so nice to everyone. In a surprisingly honest show of strategy, Millet stated her beliefs that other tributes would be less likely to kill her if she was kinder to them, and Easter asked her if she was sure about this. Without saying a word, Millet continued to fan Easter, and then grinned, before saying that he knew as well as she did that they were more likely to survive if they worked together, and that once they found Pandoria, they would be even stronger as a trio, although little did either of them know that while Millet was suggesting this potential alliance, Pandoria's body was being lifted from the arena. As the afternoon went by and the sun began to set, the pair rested and ate some of the bread and cheese that Millet had taken. Easter used the filter in the nearest water to produce some clean and drinkable water, which he then shared with Millet. Once it was dark, they discussed their strategy for the next day, although they eventually agreed to see who was still alive and where they might be by the next day. At midnight, the fallen were shown, and the portraits of Tremor from 5, the boy from 6, Flax from 9, both tributes from 10, and Pandoria from 11 were all shown in the sky, but when Pandoria's portrait was shown, Easter let out a gasp of despair. Millet put her arm on his shoulder and told him that she was sorry. He seemed temporarily inconsolable before looking back at Millet. For a second, it seemed to Millet and viewers as well that Easter might be angry enough about Pandora's death that he would attack Millet. Surprisingly, he thanked her and said that they should indeed work together for the foreseeable future. He then told her to get some rest whilst he kept the first watch. The pair seemed to find it difficult to sleep due to the intense heat that circulated through the arena, even at night. However, they continued to take turns to sleep after sunrise, which allowed them to be relatively well rested, and they were both fully awake by the mid-morning. After doing a brief lookout in all directions from their small forest, neither Easter nor Millet could spot any other tributes on the horizon, and unbeknownst to them, the vast majority of tributes were on the other side of the arena, with the nearest tribute being over 2 kilometers from them. Millet then asked Easter if he could give her another lesson on how to use a spear. At first, Easter seemed hesitant, but Millet pointed out that there was not much else to do right now. So as the morning turned to afternoon, Easter helped Millet improve her accuracy and strength with the spear by throwing it against various trees within the small forest, and although Millet had possessed a certain degree of accuracy with the spear before entering the arena, Easter helped Millet to improve her skill even further. Once they appeared to have finished, Easter insisted that Millet give him loads of the remaining bread, and Millet seemed happy to oblige. But just as she walked back through the bushes to where they had left their supplies, she suddenly dropped down when she saw Coil from 3, walking towards their location. Although Coil was still some distance away, Millet whispered to Easter what she had just seen, and he snuck through the bushes towards her. He then nipped back to grab the spear, before stating that it was time to put the lesson into practice, and as Coil began to walk nearer, the pair discussed how they could attack her. Millet appeared to be very nervous as she hid in the bushes at the entrance of the small forest, but Easter, who she could see hiding behind some other bushes slightly further into the forest, nodded at her reassuringly. The pair had left their loaf of bread between the bushes next to Easter, and as Coil entered the forest, she appeared elated to see it lying on the ground in front of her. Coil ran straight towards the loaf, but just as she picked it up, she finally seemed quite suspicious of what it had been doing there, but it was too late. As Easter jumped out from behind a bush, Coil screamed and began to run, but he quickly tackled her to the ground. Coil desperately tried to free herself from Easter's grip, but Millet appeared from behind the other bush with the spear in her hands. Millet walked slowly towards Quayle, who was screaming for help, but just as she held the spear over her potential victim, she appeared to hesitate. As Quayle screamed and cried even more, Easter shouted at Millet to hurry, with Quayle now kicking him in the shins. Millet then breathed out and apologized to Quayle before jamming the spear through her head. Quayle's blood splattered against Millet's leg, and a cannon sounded. Millet walked away and vomited behind a bush, and Easter got up and angrily asked Millet why she had hesitated, to which she replied that she had never killed anyone before, which led her to sit down and cry, with her head in her hands. After watching Millet, Easter walked away with the filter and gathered some water, before coming back to her and giving her some water. Easter then apologized for getting angry with Millet, and she apologized back to him for taking too long to kill Quayle. The pair rested, and Millet took a nap whilst Easter kept watch over the horizon, but he did not see anyone. Another cannon sounded in the early afternoon, which was revealed to viewers to be Medica from 12 when she was cornered by the career pack and stabbed in the heart by Almondine. Millet awoke from her nap an hour later, and Easter asked if she would be willing to keep watch whilst he slept, but just as Millet was agreeing to this, something in the distance caught her eye. She quickly ducked down, and Easter somewhat automatically followed suit. Millet confirmed that she had just seen someone not too far away, walking perpendicular to their direction, which Eugenia stated was Healer from 12. Millet grabbed the spear and began to crawl through the grass to the nearest water, but Easter grabbed onto her foot and asked her what their plan was. They then very quickly decided to head through the water straight ahead of them, which should lead them to reach Healer's position when he walked past this stretch of water. The pair crawled into the water, which compared to the high temperatures that they had suffered since entering the arena, seemed to be a welcome relief for them. They proceeded to swim through the water, while staying beneath the surface for as much of this time as they could. After 2 or 3 minutes, they reached the location where Healer would be due to cross over this stretch of water. Unfortunately for Easter and Millet, he had been too busy fanning himself with his hands to notice their heads poking out of the water in front of him. Once Healer was within eyesight of Easter and Millet, Easter had very carefully hid himself in the grass that grew out over the water, and Millet submerged himself beneath the water with her spear at the ready. Healer appeared to be thinking about how it was best to cross this waterway, but as he looked down in front of his foot, he appeared confused, and an excited murmur from the viewers in Snow Square started to erupt as they saw that Healer was noticing that there was something unusual in the water just in front of him. Healer began to crouch down to see what this was, but just as he spotted Millet in the water in front of him and he gasped loudly, Easter suddenly lunged out of the water and grabbed Healer by the foot. He yelped and turned to run, but this caused him to collapse to the ground. He then screamed and seemed to be trying to remove his shoe, but Easter pulled him back by his leg into the water. As Healer desperately tried to free himself from Easter's grip, Millet rose out of the water and stabbed him through the head with a spear. This time, when the pair were drenched in blood, Millet did not even flinch, and she once again thrust the spear through Healer's head, which sounded his cannon, and Easter released his grip, letting Healer's body slide back down into the water. Within a minute, the pair were walking back to the small forest where they had left their supplies. As it got dark, they once again rested and ate. Millet asked Easter some more about his life back home, and she was surprised to hear that he had no prior experience with spears. However, he let her know that he had learned from a young age that he needed to be able to pick up new skills as quickly as possible, or he would not have been able to support his family. Easter went to sleep first that night, and as Millet kept watch, she saw the portraits of Quayle from 3 and Healer and Medica from 12, which left 15 tributes remaining. The next morning, as Millet was waking up, Easter was already eating some of the bread and drinking water from the filter, and he remarked to Millet how hot it was. Although the pair had already removed their jackets, and Easter had just removed his t-shirt, Millet stated that she hoped Easter did not mind, before removing her own t-shirt, although luckily for her modesty, she was wearing a bra beneath. Yet as Millet ate, she appeared worried by how little of the bread was left. When she mentioned this to Easter, he grinned and said, "Make some more, farm girl," which made her grin and throw some of the bread at Easter, which he quickly took. However, as Millet jokingly tried to take this bread back from Easter, and he desperately tried to put it in his mouth, they heard a scream in the far distance and quickly froze. As Easter grabbed the spear and Millet scoured the horizon, presumably for any other tributes or an explanation of what was causing this scream, they began to hear more screams from different directions, and Millet stated that she could see rain coming towards them, but as the rain continued to near them, Millet seemed to feel a pain coming from her arm, where a raindrop had just hit her, Within seconds, a cannon sounded, and Easter shouted that this rainfall was acidic. They both immediately thrust their t-shirts on, and Millet grabbed the remaining bread and filter, but just as Easter, who was wincing in pain, grabbed the spear, Millet was suddenly pushed forward by Jamie from 8, who viewers had seen to have snuck into the small forest within the night, although he had not heard Easter and Millet until minutes earlier. Millet fell over and instinctively held the filter to protect herself from Jamie, whilst holding her other hand over her face, in order to protect it from the rain. Jamie ran towards her with his sword, but Easter quickly threw the spear. Jamie was only a few metres from where Easter stood, and it hit his heart with such force that it went through his body and he quickly collapsed. As Jamie's cannon sounded, Easter retrieved a spear and shouted that they needed to run for the water. He picked up Millet by the arm and tried to force her to run with him, but before Easter could even start running, Millet broke free of Easter's grip and turned around. She ran back and seized Jamie's sword, before ripping off his jacket, which he had tied around his waist. Easter seemed confused by what Millet was doing, but once she started running back in his direction, he appeared to understand, before running ahead and throwing himself into the water. As Easter resurfaced, Millet also entered the water, and she held Jamie's jacket over their heads, in order to protect them from the rain. Easter grinned when he realised why Millet had run back for the jacket, and he told her that this was indeed a good idea. Although the pair had received some scarring on their skin from the rain, they had not been as badly affected as some other tributes. They rested in the water, beneath the jacket, and as the rainfall continued, they spoke a little more about where they thought the other tributes might be. During this time, it was noted that Millet was leaning in towards Easter and gripping against his body for what she described as warmth. Even though Easter did not seem too enthused by Millet's apparent attempts at seduction, Eugenia mentioned that one has to give a girl credit for trying. After almost 2 hours, the rain subsided and Millet and Easter decided to head back to the forest. When they reached their former resting area, they collapsed in exhaustion, and although Easter looked like he was about to fall asleep, Millet woke him up when she saw 2 sponsor gifts flying down towards them. They were elated to discover that Easter had been gifted with a healing ointment for their injuries from the acid rain, whilst Millet received a small picnic, and they quickly agreed to share their gifts with each other. Yet just as they applied the ointment and started to eat, a cannon was heard. Although Millet seemed rather worried about where this cannon had come from, Easter reassured her, and it was seen by viewers that it was Custer, from 2, who had died. He had sprained his ankle when he ran from the rainfall, and although he had eventually caught up with the careers and sheltered with them, he was in a lot of pain from his injuries, and once the rain had stopped, Almondine nodded to Relic, who was sat behind Castor, and he stabbed him in the back of the head, which led to Castor dying almost immediately. The sun soon set, and Millet fell asleep rather early, so Easter kept watch over her. When midnight came by, the portraits of Castor from 2, Blenda from 5, and Jamie from 8 were all shown, which meant that there were now 12 tributes remaining. As the next day began, Easter awoke to find Millet staring off into the horizon. He got up and approached her, but she quickly spun around with Jamie's sword in her hand. Although she relaxed when she realised that this was only Easter, Millet had been trying to use the filter on some of the water between the marshes, but it appeared to no longer be working. Little did she know that the filters were only designed to be used a handful of times, and this had even caused several other tributes to fall ill from drinking contaminated water. Because the temperature seemed even higher than it had been yesterday, Millet and Easter realised that they needed to find clean water as soon as possible, and they eventually decided to head back to the cornucopia, where they hoped to find clean water or a filter that could be used to access clean water. After gathering their belongings, they started walking, but quickly heard screaming coming from the direction of the cornucopia. Whilst trudging onwards, Millet asked, "What now?" to Easter, who shrugged and reminded her to be on guard, but after hearing some more screaming coming from far off to their right, Easter suggested that they get into the water, in order to hide themselves from anyone who might be able to see them. Millet reluctantly obliged, and they continued to swim slowly through the waterway towards the cornucopia. They seemed to stop noticing the occasional screams that occurred, and did not even seem fazed when they heard 2 cannons sound within a minute of each other. As they began to approach the cornucopia lake, they were still unaware of what was causing the screams, although these were now coming from either behind them or far off to their right. Millet, who was swimming ahead of Easter, was still looking at the surrounding marshland and not paying much attention to the water in front of her, but Easter grabbed onto the back of her shoulder when he noticed that something was moving through the water towards them. Millet looked round at Easter and asked him why he had stopped her, but just at that moment a large alligator suddenly came to the surface of the water in front of them and opened its snout extremely widely. Millet screamed and turned back to Easter, and she tried to wade through to the side of the water. The alligator clamped down its snout where Millet had been swimming and ripped off some of her jacket. She screamed as it turned to swim towards her, and she tried to get out of this deeper water, but slipped back in, directly in the path of this alligator. It opened its snout once again, but just as it was about to slam its teeth shut on Millet's arm, she used her hands to prise its snout apart. Easter watched in shock as Millet desperately tried to keep the alligator's snout open, before finally coming to his senses and thrusting his spear through its right eye. Even this failed to fully stop the alligator, and it seemed to become rather angry instead. Millet screamed as the alligator growled even more loudly at her, but Easter then stabbed it in the left eye, with such force that it pushed the alligator backwards. As Millet breathed out in shock, Easter quickly waded towards her and placed his finger over his mouth to show that she needed to be quiet. The alligator roared and snapped its snout open and shut continually, whilst Millet remained frozen just in front of it. Easter then threw the filter far enough for it to hit the water behind the alligator, and this seemed to divert its attention. Easter waded over to Millet, who still seemed practically incapable of movement, before taking her by the hand and helping her out of the water. Whilst the alligator continued to blindly snap around in the water, Easter took Millet's hand and ran away with her along the marsh. Without saying a word, they ran back in the direction of the forest to the spot where they had been resting. Unbeknownst to the pair, Game Maker Whimsywick had set alligators to attack every tribute in the arena over this hour. Although almost all tributes had escaped without injury, Sorba from 7 and Lint from 8 were not so fortunate. The pair had been swimming through a waterway at the other side of the arena to Easter and Millet, when an alligator had suddenly appeared in front of them. Lint was quickly bitten in the neck and hence eliminated by the alligator. Although Sorba had managed to get out of the water, she proceeded to flee into the forest where the career tributes were resting, and after coming to a stop, she was shot with an arrow in the heart by Zella. When Easter and Millet reached their forest, Millet still seemed to be in shock, and Easter put his arm around her. He told her how clever she had been to think of opening the alligator's snout so quickly, and he tried to bring some humour to what had happened, although Millet only managed a weak smile. Easter kissed her on the cheek, and Millet responded that he did not need to do this, to which Easter replied that he was so happy that he had not killed her on the first day. This comment made Millet gradually laugh more and more, which in turn made Easter laugh as well. They put their arms around each other and looked off into the sunset. After a few minutes, they were each sent a bottle of water by sponsors. It was clear to viewers how valuable this gift was to the pair, with several other tributes now desperate for water, but both Millet and Easter drank modest amounts in order to ration their supply. Easter offered to keep watch first and let Millet sleep, for which she thanked him, and he said that she was welcome. At midnight, the portraits of Sorba from 7 and Lint from 8 were shown, which left just 10 tributes remaining. Millet and Easter were awoken by a cannon as the sun rose the next morning. They speculated about whose cannon this could be, but it was shown to viewers at the time that Zela, who had been keeping watch over the other careers, had tried to attack Almundine while she slept. But Relic saw what she was about to do, and quickly shot her with his own arrow, which killed Zela and saved Almundine. As the pair each swigged some of their water, Game Maker Whimsywick announced that with 9 tributes remaining, a feast would be held at dusk. Although Millet was a little dubious about attending this feast, she was quickly convinced by Easter that if they were to attend, they could access useful supplies and possibly eliminate some of their competition. The pair rested during the morning and kept watch, but that afternoon they carefully made their way through the waterways to the centre of the arena. The heat was also more intense, which led to even more tributes entering the water in order to cool down. By the time dusk was approaching, Millet and Easter had settled themselves under the overhanging grass in a waterway next to the cornucopia lake, and they were waiting for the sun to reach the horizon so that the central platform with the feast bags would appear. Although they were looking around for other tributes, they were unable to see any, but when the sun finally touched the horizon, they saw the platform rising out of the central mound. Both Millet and Easter watched this area in a suspenseful silence, and Millet quickly whispered that it looked like nobody else was around. Yet just as Easter told her to wait, Simeon from 7 suddenly appeared on the other side of the lake and dived inwards. Millet and Easter watched very carefully, and Millet said that they should try to run in as well, but just as she finished the sentence, Almandine and Relic appeared at another edge of the lake and dived straight towards the central mound. Millet and Easter watched Simeon climb onto the central mound and grab his feast bag, but as he looked around and appeared to be looking for the best direction to exit, he appeared to notice that someone was swimming beneath the water towards him, and just as he looked ready to swim in the opposite direction, Relic appeared from the water and shot an arrow at Simeon's shoulder, which caused him to fall into the water. Relic then waded through the water towards Simeon, and Almandine grabbed the feast bag for District 1, but just as Relic raised his sword, Simeon picked up some mud from the bottom of the lake and threw it at Relic's face. As Relic shouted out and held his eyes in pain, Simeon grabbed him by the neck and put a knife to his throat. Almandine then pointed an arrow at Simeon, but did not seem to dare to shoot it in case she hit Relic. Easter could just about see the standoff occurring on the other side of the central mound, and he told Millet that now was the time to grab the feast bag, whilst the Careers and Simeon were distracted by each other. As Simeon tried to force Almandine to give over District 1's feast bag in exchange for Relic's life, Millet silently slipped into the water and waded towards the central mound as quietly as she could. She listened as Simeon and Almandine shouted at each other before carefully climbing up, and then without standing up, she pulled the bags for Districts 9 and 11 from the platform. Almandine was stood just a metre in front of this platform, but as her back was turned, she had not noticed Millet taking these bags. As Millet swam back, Simeon was suddenly distracted by the sound of her swimming, and Almandine shot her arrow, which hit Simeon in the eye, and by the time she and Relic had gathered their feast bag and turned back round to see Millet, she was already escaping into the distance and back towards Easter, who was still waiting for her. The pair looked back to the cornucopia where they could see that Almandine and Relic were still standing on the central mound and guarding the remaining feast bags. Easter stated that he wanted to wait around for any other tributes who might be escaping, but Millet said that she felt unsafe and she wanted to go back to the small forest, which Easter eventually agreed to. They continued back through the waterways, occasionally turning round to the cornucopia lake to check that Almandine and Relic were not following them, but as the darkness set in and they moved further from the central area, it became harder for Millet and Easter to see them, and so they continued swimming onwards in silence for almost 10 minutes. But just as Millet turned towards Easter and said that it was probably safe for them to climb out of the water, he quickly shushed her and whispered that he could see something coming towards them from behind, along the side of the waterway. Millet was immediately quiet, and she and Easter quickly hid themselves underneath the grass that hanged over the side of the waterway. They watched as this figure moved closer, and it was revealed by Eugenia that this was Jack from 3, who had given up on trying to grab his feast bag from the central lake and was now heading back to the perimeter, which he had previously been resting. As Jack walked closer along the bank to where Easter and Millet were, Easter whispered to Millet to have the spear at the ready, and when Jack walked past them, Easter hurled himself out of the water and grabbed Jack by the legs. Jack shouted out in a mixture of surprise and pain, but Easter quickly dragged him back into the waterway. Before Jack even appeared to have any idea of what was happening, Millet stabbed him through the head with the spear, and his cannon sounded. However, after this kill, Millet looked at Easter, who could make out her gaze through the darkness. She then jabbed the spear gently in his direction, and he instinctively moved back in the water, which caused him to lose his balance and tumble beneath the surface before re-emerging. Upon seeing Easter suddenly become very defensive and look like he would attack Millet, she laughed and said that she was only joking with him, although Easter said that this was not funny and that he could take her down with or without a spear. Millet then replied that if this were true, Easter would not need to worry about her. He quietly looked at her for a few seconds, and the crowds in Snow Square went completely quiet in suspense, but Easter simply proceeded to remind Millet that she needed to be careful with the spear. As the hovercraft approached, the pair headed back to the small forest before any other tributes came to investigate. Once they were back in the forest, they finally opened their bags, and it was revealed that they had each only been gifted with a bottle of water. They both seemed annoyed that they had risked their lives for a relatively small sponsor gift, but as the heat began to increase, even during the night, they both appeared pleased to have access to more water. Shortly before midnight, Easter stated that he could not sleep and sat with Millet. She apologized to Easter for her earlier joke involving the spear, and he grinned, before saying that he forgave her, and that this place could mess with your sense of humour. They continued to look up at the stars and moon, before speaking about the possibility of life on other worlds. A few minutes later, their discussion was interrupted, when the portraits of Zella from 2, Jack from 3, and Simeon from 7 were each shown in the sky, which left Almondine and Relic from 1, Bob and Norrie from 4, and Louisiana from 6 as the only remaining opponents to Millet and Easter. When the sun rose the next morning, all 7 of the surviving tributes commented on the sheer levels of heat that had noticeably increased and became even worse in the outer areas of the arena. Millet and Easter realized that they would now need to head inwards towards the cornucopia lake, and they started walking along the nearest waterway in this direction. Yet just when they were starting to approach the inner third of the arena, Millet appeared to notice something in the water. As she and Easter continued walking, they passed this stretch of water where Millet thought she had seen something, but she whispered to Easter that although he should not turn around, there was something or someone in the water behind them. The camera cut back to the studio, and Crane stated that Millet had just seen Louisiana, who had spent most of the game hiding in this spot of the water. She had kept her eyes closed as Millet and Easter walked past, in order to keep her entire face camouflaged, but she blinked her right eye at the wrong time, which gave away her position to Millet. After a few seconds of continuing to walk, Easter and Millet suddenly charged back, and Louisiana quickly surged out of the water. She tried to get out on the opposing bank, but Easter rapidly dove towards her and tackled her back into the water. Millet then entered the water next to Louisiana and held the spear ready to attack her. Louisiana desperately tried to free herself from Easter's grip and clawed at his face, which made him shout out in pain, but after taking a few seconds to ready her grip on the spear, Millet forced it through the side of Louisiana's head, and her cannon sounded. Yet shortly after pulling the spear back, Millet looked at Easter and suddenly lunged forwards. Only realizing what Millet was attempting at the very last moment, Easter lunged to his left and was hit in the side by the spear. Millet grimaced as she tried to plunge it further into Easter's flesh, but he managed to throw himself backwards through the water, which displaced the spear, and he held his side in pain. Millet burst into tears as she thrust the spear at Easter again, but Easter managed to dodge Millet's aim. It is unknown why Millet proceeded to take the following action, but she quickly jumped up onto the bank of the waterway and tried to run away with the spear in her hand. However, Easter pulled on the other end of the spear. Although Millet had just made it onto the bank, this sudden tug from Easter made her lose her balance, and she dropped the spear. Easter then grabbed the spear and held it to face towards Millet, who proceeded to fall back into the water towards the spear. It impaled Millet's left lung, and she instantly gasped out in pain. Easter looked shocked at what had just happened, and he shook as he held the spear, whilst Millet looked at him and tried to mouth something. Easter turned a crisp shade of pale as Millet cried and put her hand out towards him. He clasped onto her hand, and the tears rolled down Millet's cheek before she finally managed to muster the energy to say sorry to Easter. Within a minute, Millet's cannon sounded, and Easter got out of the water with the spear, which proved to be extremely painful for him due to the injury that he had just received in his side. As the hovercraft came to collect Millet and Louisiana's bodies, Easter proceeded to run off towards the forest where he had previously rested with Millet. After a while of unsuccessfully trying to relieve the intense pain that he was experiencing from this injury, Easter was sent a sponsor gift, which was revealed to be an advanced bandage that had recently been crafted by the best minds of District 12 and was able to heal flesh at a miraculously fast rate. As the sun set, Easter's injury appeared to be improving, and he ate some of the remaining bread. That night, Easter seemed incapable of sleeping properly, probably due to the relentless heat and the fact that he and the other tributes were probably fully aware that tomorrow would likely be the final day of the games. At midnight, the portraits of Louisiana from 6 and Millet from 9 were shown, which left a total of only 5 tributes remaining. For the rest of the night, Easter appeared to only sleep for a total of an hour, and he often awoke whenever the slightest noise was heard. As the sun rose, the arena reached the highest temperature of the game so far, and Easter grabbed his spear before forcing himself into the cool water of the nearest waterway. He carefully swam towards the center of the arena, with his spear at the ready. As he got nearer, he continually looked around for any sign of another tribute, but he did not realize that all of the other tributes had entered the waterways as well, for the same reason. However, as he continued through the water, he apparently failed to realize that the depth of the water was slowly beginning to descend. Easter rested once he was within just a few hundred meters of the cornucopia, but the water, which had had no current throughout the games, started pulling him back against the direction that he had come. Easter panicked as he tried to grab onto the grass at the sides of the waterways, but it was now coming off very easily and was impossible for Easter to grip onto. The water's depth was lowering, and Easter was being pulled along quicker. Even when he tried to run his feet along the mud at the bottom of the waterway, this failed to slow him down, and he shouted in terror when he saw a large jagged blade spinning around a drain in the ground and pulling in any water that it could. Easter began to swear with fright, but when the water had lowered even further, he pushed his feet against the bottom of the waterway and almost managed to reach the side of the bank. He did not quite reach high enough and fell back into the water, but just as he was within meters of the spinning blade, he jumped back up again by using the floor to help him. Easter managed to grab onto the side of the bank, and without looking back at the spinning blade, which was now almost beneath him, he used all his strength to pull himself back up onto the side of the bank. As he lay in exhaustion, he heard a scream, followed by a cannon in the distance, and it was shown to viewers that this belonged to Relic, who had failed to exit the waterway quickly enough, and had therefore been pulled into a drain and chopped into pieces in the process. However, Almondine, who had been with Relic, had just about escaped in time. After hearing the cannon, Easter looked over and saw Almondine running back to the central lake. At the side of this lake, Bob and Norrie were resting in exhaustion. Yet without appearing to notice Almondine running towards them, Bob suddenly stood up and attacked Norrie, who was still lying down. He continually stabbed her in the stomach, and although Norrie tried to defend herself, her efforts were fruitless, and her movement soon ceased. As her cannon sounded, Bob finally turned around, although it was too late for him to defend himself, and Almondine threw a knife straight at his heart, which sounded his cannon before he hit the floor. Easter had been watching this fight from only about 20 meters away, although Almondine had seemingly failed to notice him hiding in the grass. Easter then seemed extremely confused when Almondine suddenly raised her knife into the air and cheered victoriously. Whilst many viewers in Snow Square were also confused by her premature happiness, Crane stated to Eugenia that "it looks like someone hasn't been keeping track," and it seemed to suddenly dawn on Easter that Almondine believed that all the other tributes were dead, and hence she was the victor. Almondine was gradually rotating herself and seemed to be looking for the hovercraft that would lift her to safety. Therefore, when Easter saw Almondine begin to turn in the opposite direction once more, he suddenly got up and charged towards her. Only at the last minute did Almondine notice that Easter was moving towards her, but before she could even ready her knife, Easter had thrown the spear straight through her head, and within a second of its impact, Almondine stumbled to the floor and her cannon sounded. A few seconds later, it was announced that Easter Rollix from District 11 was the winner of the 83rd Hunger Games. Although most victors were pleased when their victory was announced, Easter suddenly grabbed onto the wound in his side, and as the hovercraft came into view, he clutched this wound and fell to the ground. Medical staff were immediately sent down to the arena and helped place Easter onto the stretcher that was subsequently lifted to the hovercraft. Easter spent the next few days in Ravenstill Hospital under the expert care of several leading medics that had generously been provided by the capital. This led to the victor's interview occurring slightly later than normal, although Easter gave a confident interview and was once again very charming to Eugenia, which of course improved his standing with the crowd. Eugenia asked Easter about Millet, and whether he had been tempted to turn on her when she had turned on him, to which he replied that he was not planning to turn on her until the end, which surprised many of the audience members. Furthermore, Easter mentioned that he would likely not have made it anywhere near as far as he did without Millet's help, and although she had eventually turned on him, he still considered her his friend, which garnered sympathetic sounds from the audience. A month later, Bluebell Jansen passed away in her sleep, and her funeral was broadcast throughout Panem. Geranio and Easter spoke at her funeral, and due to Bluebell's contributions to Panem, an extra year's worth of grain was gifted to the citizens of District 11, thanks to the capital. Soon after settling back down in District 11, Easter moved with his family to a house in the Victor's village, and his parents were able to stop working. Easter continued his post in the LeBlanc alcohol production facility, and as part of Panem's expanding trade deals with Scotland, Easter became one of the leading architects behind a trade route of whiskey and liquor with this country, which greatly improved the variety of these substances within District 11. He also got married to his wife, Tulip, with whom he had 3 children.